Welcome to Conversations. I'm Bill Kristol, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Harvey Mansfield, my teacher,
Good to see you.
to discuss his teacher,
Thank
Leo
you.
Strauss,
Yeah,
who wasn't actually your teacher, however,
he
as
wasn't.
an undergraduate or graduate student. So
Very
I
true.
noticed in the acknowledgments in your first book, which was your doctoral dissertation, you thank various Harvard professors, and then you thank
did.
Leo Strauss. And so how did that happen?
Well, I certainly had to thank my hero, which was Sam Beer. I later wrote a book all about him called Manliness.
Right.
He was the most manly man I ever met, and so he deserved to have a book in his honor. But my real teacher was not he, or not William Yandell Elliott, whom I also mentioned, but Leo Strauss. I developed an acquaintance with Leo Strauss. It began by meeting Harry Jaffa in Columbus, Ohio. Harry Jaffa was one of Strauss's students, and he was an assistant professor in my father's department of political science. My father was the chairman of the Ohio State Political Science Department, and Harry Jaffa was in there. And so Harry, as a high school student, this would be about 1948, 49, took me under his wing and introduced me to political theory. I'd had a previous introduction from David Spitz, who was a liberal, but for some reason I was more convinced by Harry Jaffa than by David Spitz.
Jaffa,
So
I guess, studied with Strauss
he studied
at the
with
New School in
at the New
40s.
School for Social Research in New York. That was where Strauss came when he first arrived in America as a refugee scholar. So perhaps the next stage was going through Harvard and studying with Sam Beer. And then in 1953, when I graduated, I read Natural Right and History, which was Strauss's great book on the issues that most people understand, and perhaps the best way still to approach his thought. Natural Right and History was, you could say, begins with an attack on the fact-value distinction, which is the way social science operates, and the way in which I was taught at Harvard. I was always dissatisfied with that because I thought there was more to value or valuing than just assertion, just saying the way you would love things to be, or wishes. So, But on the other hand, I was always dissatisfied with the rigidity, as it seemed to me, of the natural law position, or the Catholic conservatism of natural law, which it seemed to me was too rigid and insufficiently flexible, didn't leave enough room for human prudence. So Strauss was right in the middle between those two. He was believed that it was a matter of knowledge, say, whether someone was an honest person or not. But on the other hand, to go further than that required a lot of interpretation and a lot of thinking on which reasonable people might disagree. And he later developed the distinction between, well, he does in his book, between natural right and natural law. So that was in 1953. And then, a little bit later, I met him, I think. That was about 1958 in Chicago. I'd been invited to one of the conferences that Robert Goldwyn, one of his students, managed with public figures of one kind or another. I've forgotten which one it was in this case, but Strauss was there, and he smiled at me, and we met, and that was a great pleasure. And then later on, when I was at my first job, which was at the University of California, Berkeley, I got to know him the way a student would get to know a teacher. Up till then, I was the guy from Harvard. Strauss had a low opinion of Harvard.
Shocking,
Thought,
really?
Yes, it was.
He was right on so many other things.
Yeah, right. But he had a low opinion of Harvard, it has to be said. It was perhaps a certain sense of rivalry with a friend of his, or at least an acquaintance of his from Germany, Carl Friedrich, who was, of course, the most famous political theorist at Harvard at this time. But for whatever reason, he somehow preferred the University of Chicago to Harvard, University of Chicago being where he now was. So it was graced. It was certainly graced by his presence and So I can't blame him for that.
Right.
Yeah, that little opinion of his. So I was always, in a way, when I was with him, it was always with his other students, and they were more deferent to him, or rather, he was more commanding to them. And, whereas me, I had gotten my PhD from elsewhere and other people, and this, paradoxically, you might think, set me on a level of equality, mock equality with him. So he would ask me my opinion. He didn't ask me what Harvard thought, but he had me down as a Protestant. So that meant that I knew Luther and Calvin through and through. And so when it came up, as it sometimes it did, what was the Protestant view of this or that, I was consulted and made to rattle off, which of course I couldn't do at all. What kind of wisdom there might have been in those two great but totally unknown to me thinkers.
Right.
So that was. Now we're getting into the period when I was in his reading group at Berkeley. This would have been 1960 to 61. So he was that year. He left Chicago just to come for 1 year to the advanced behavioral center or Center for Behavioral Studies, which was in Palo Alto, and I was in Berkeley. So the reading group met on Wednesday evening.
So that was just good luck that you were
just
both
good luck
in this
that,
Bay Area
that
the
he
same
was
year.
there.
Yeah.
That's right. And he had a reading group. He had brought several of his students with him, and the two most memorable were Ralph Lerner and Martin Diamond, who were there and who I got to know, made good friends with in that year. So he had this reading group on Wednesdays from 8 until 12. That was how long he went. He had had a heart attack.
PM.
PM.
Yeah.
PM,
Very
of course.
European. Yeah, no,
Yeah. Oh, no. 8 to 12. And he had had a heart attack the year before, and so Mrs. Strauss had given orders that he had to be stopped at 12. Otherwise, he would go on and on and on. And when he stopped at 12, we all had we had sort of hors d'oeuvres, something to eat and something to drink, and then the gossip began. And the meeting usually broke up about 1:30. And Wednesday was a tough day for me because I had a class in the morning and then a seminar in the afternoon, which ended at 6 p.m. So at 6 p.m. I had to make it all the way from Berkeley to Palo Alto, driving over the Bay Bridge, eating a sandwich on the way, in order to arrive at 8. And of course, at the return trip was something not to be imagined. But it was a wonderful experience. It was a most challenging intellectual experience of my life, and then and still now, to meet someone of that brain power. It took all my abilities to try to keep up with him. So that was a new experience for me.
And what did you read?
We read some Plato, Lachis, Plato's Dialogue on Courage. That's what we started from. But it was mostly Aristophanes, because he was then writing his book, which came out later, called Socrates and Aristophanes. So that's really my acquaintance with him. I knew him. I can't say I was really close to him, but we were very friendly, and occasionally he would write to me something that he found out, and he took a great interest. He read my dissertation on Burke, which then was published in the book you just mentioned, Statesmanship and Party Government. And I was told, this was a great honor, I was told that Strauss had stopped Robert Goldwyn, the same one who ran the conferences, in the street one day, and that he told Goldwyn, "I've just finished reading a book I wish I had written."
That is a great honor, though. Yeah.
And but he never said that to me.
Well, that would have gone to your head. So
yes, it probably would have.
But Goldwyn told you that was good of him.
Yes, he did. Yes, it was good of him. Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's great, though.
All right, so. But I got to see him now and again, a couple times in Annapolis after he'd stopped teaching in Chicago. And from this time, so that was 1961, and when he was at Berkeley, then he died in 1973, so about a dozen years later.
Did he ever come to Harvard?
No, but he came to Boston and gave a talk there. But I did invite him when I was to give a talk at Berkeley, which he did, where I had just arrived. I was a totally green assistant professor, and here I was inviting this famous but somewhat controversial, even disliked, disapproved of professor. And he gave a talk to the Berkeley crowd, who listened not altogether respectfully, certainly not in agreement, but that was my time that I invited him.
That's good.
Yeah.
It's disappointing that he never set foot, apparently, though, on the Harvard campus. That, I guess, that's to Harvard's demerit.
Yeah, I think that may have been the case. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's been, there's been so much written and so many levels of, I guess, accretion of commentary on Strauss and attacks on Strauss, defenses of Strauss, but in a way you encountered him fresh. So what would you say to, if someone asked, well, what's all this Strauss? You're a Straussian. What does that mean? What's the right way to begin thinking about Strauss?
Right. Well, I already mentioned the right approach, and that I think is to read natural right and history, because, as I say, that is his analysis of the current intellectual situation in America, in the West, and the background of it. So that's the book to start with. On the other hand, he made a great discovery, or rediscovery, and that was the existence of esoteric writing. And so this is the most striking thing about Strauss. And when you become a Straussian, there's always a point of conversion. That word, that kind of religious word, is almost appropriate for that. And that is when you discover and begin to appreciate esoteric writing. Esoteric writing means, to quote a title of a recent book, means philosophy between the lines. This is a title of a recent book by Arthur Melzer, which I very much recommend to anyone who wants to study Strauss, in which he presents the much overlooked evidence, much of it, so much evidence there is of esoteric writing by philosophers and by their references to the need for this. What esoteric writing is this. There isn't just one audience for philosopher. He lives in his time, but he also lives beyond his time. So he wants to address other philosophers, but he also wants to address the people in his time. These are two different audiences, because the first audience, you might say the audience of eternity, deals with those permanent and eternal questions, most of which cannot be answered finally, or at least in such a way that everyone will agree. It's notorious that philosophers disagree, and yet they all love being philosophers, and they respect other philosophers. Now, the thing is that to study the permanent questions means to unsettle the temporary answers or agreements that societies have. Societies can't live on disagreement or on total dissension or on mere skepticism. They have to have an answer, and each has to have its own answer, a kind of official answer. And this is true even of liberal or democracies or free societies. They have a certain amount of disagreement, which they call pluralism. But say for example, in America, that all men are created equal, that the way to think about justice is to think in terms of rights. These are fundamental principles which really cannot be questioned by an American, or at least politically by an American. So society has its beliefs and philosophy has its questions. And that's a diremption, that's a dichotomy which cannot ever be totally overcome. And this cannot fail to impress itself upon any philosophers, so the philosopher quickly sees the need for addressing these two audiences differently, but in the same work. So it isn't that you have a little-known work that is your esoteric writing and a better-known one, exoteric. No, the two are always mixed together, so that the careful reader, that is a philosopher, can see things, problems in the text, in which the careful writer inserts remarks that are intended for the philosopher and not just for the political people or the moral people of his time. And that's what Strauss discovered or rediscovered, because it was perfectly well known to all philosophers up until about the beginning of the 19th century. At that time, history appeared on the scene, and the notion arrived that a thinker was a creature or a child of his own time. A child of his own time, that's a phrase of Hegel, so 19th century philosopher, perhaps the greatest. And according to that view, every philosopher is a spokesman for the myths or the beliefs or the opinions or even the truths of his time, but of his time only. And eternal problems don't exist, and certainly the several eternal solutions which one can see in the history of philosophy are each of them compartmentalized into stages of world history. Not for us today, we've settled that. So, for example, the religious question, that's all dead, and that's obsolete. That's not a 21st century question. So that's the historical view, and that took over from the you might say the other rival view that made room for esotericism, and it really denied that there was a distinction between what was said to philosophers and what was said to political people, but that the two could be blended together or needed to be blended together, and that really no philosopher really had the ability to be critical of his own time. That's really what it's saying. If you're a child of your own time, that means you can't be a critic. And that was very destructive of philosophy. So philosophy really lives on the possibility of esoteric communication. Otherwise, it's taken over by the beliefs of its own time. And so that was Strauss's great discovery, which he made. So this story is, I don't remember it very well, in a Berlin library when he was reading a text of Avicenna on Plato's laws. And Avicenna remarked that Plato was understanding this, the legislator as a kind of prophet. Well, that meant that the philosopher was trying to give a way in which to understand the laws of any society, not as philosophically based, but as religious, with a kind of religious foundation, or one might say covering even. And so, and Strauss began to expand on this marvelous insight, and found all kinds of esoteric writing in unsuspecting places. One of his great discoveries was Xenophon, the Greek philosopher Xenophon, who had always been despised as a kind of not very intelligent, gentlemanly type, a good fellow, but really not very sharp. And Strauss showed that far from that, he was a very sharp fellow, pretending to be a good sort of gentlemanly type, and that he was right there on a par with Plato and with other philosophers, and far superior to his denigrators in modern times among classical scholars. So that was in one of his many writings on Xenophon. He tried to show, as he once put it, tried to make to recover the greatness of Xenophon.
Right.
So together with esotericism, you also discover exotericism. Exotericism is the way in which a philosopher has to present the beliefs of his own time to the people who live in his own time in such a way as not to so much to lead them to truth as to lead them to political stability and moral decency.
And also to protect himself.
And also to protect himself.
Persecution and the art of
Yes.
writing. I mean, Strauss.
That's right, of course.
Somewhat exoterically, maybe stresses
Yes.
the simplest
The simplest
reason. Why
simplest
you would
reason,
need to-
yeah. Yeah, the simplest reason why a philosopher needs to be esoteric is to cover himself
Yeah.
from possible attack or
fate of Socrates.
A fatwa or something,
Yeah.
something like that. That was still a danger today, actually, and it used to be everywhere.
Yeah, I think in the essay "Persecution and the Art of Writing," where Strauss
Yeah,
lays this out to some degree, at least, and he says persecution, and then it seems at first that's the main reason, but then sort of a respect for the healthy opinions, not disturbing healthy opinions of society, turns out to be maybe a slightly
that's right.
deeper reason. But then education seems to be really the also, even if there weren't persecution or the tension between opinions and
Yes.
questioning, maybe philosophers would still write that way. I mean,
Yes, they would.
carefully
Yeah,
and,
if only to teach future
force you to think.
philosophers, force you to think. Yeah.
I think that part of it is
I think, yeah.
underreported sometimes.
When a good teacher walks into a classroom, say, and raises a question, and then may give one answer on one side and one answer on the other side, and say, "What do you think?" That's a contradiction. Contradiction is something that forces you to think. So if you put a deliberate contradiction in your text, say, then you raise the reader. You raise him above being a mere reader or mere follower. You force him to think on his own. And when he thinks on his own, he's getting closer to you. And he's less of a disciple or mere reader and more of a thinker. So today we set great store by original thinking. But thinking has to be original in everybody, and if it really is thinking. Otherwise, you're just accepting. However original thinker you are, it turns out at the end of the day that there aren't 1,001 possibilities, as Nietzsche fancifully suggested. No, there are several. There are several ways to look at the world. And you can, through some exercise of an effort, learn what they are, or learn the principal alternatives. And this is what would be an education that one can still get today in a college, and then perfected or maybe ruined in graduate school.
But luckily you can read the books and the commentaries of Strauss and others and you, and get the education, maybe even if your college professors aren't so great. That's a great service of Strauss.
Yes.
Presumably why people write books, maybe.
That's right.
To teach
not only did Strauss write books, but he got you to read the books that he wrote about.
Right.
So he never used his books as texts, and indeed, while he was alive, most Straussians, students of his, treated them with as if they were sacred things that one mustn't read even, or certainly not comment on publicly, and not defend publicly, because Strauss wasn't one like, say, Michael Oakeshott, who wanted Oakeshottians to read Oakeshott.
Right.
But no, he wanted you to read, the great books as those in natural right and history, Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. So if you were a Straussian, you would give a course on those books and not on Strauss. However, you might read Strauss in order to teach those books if you wanted to do a good job.
He presents himself as commenting on all these books, not on giving his own teaching.
But when I was an undergraduate, the typical course in political theory was to read excerpts from books and and then to read a textbook which would explain those excerpts, usually from a historicist point of view. But since then, and this is an effect I think Strauss has had on the teaching of political theory generally in America now, people read entire books and they read the original.
Right. Now, and I was struck even when I got to Harvard, I mean, some teachers would still talk about, we'll study X thinker and then you'd learn his doctrines. I do think one of Strauss's greatest services was right away making you see that whatever doctrines might be presented by various thinkers, those are, for whatever reason, superficial or not the real thought,
Yeah, those are exoteric.
Right.
Those are the things that he thought it would be good for you to learn or to be known to believe.
Or to go through a stage of thinking about maybe and then realizing the limitations of or something.
That's right.
Yeah, so
all that,
I mean, that's really a fantastic thing about Strauss. I think that you don't get you get beyond the sort of so-and-so believed X and so-and-so taught Y, and you really have to think through the text.
Yeah. There's certainly such a thing as a Straussian, but never such a thing as Straussianism.
Yeah, that's a
there's never. It's not a Marxism that finds a parallel in Strauss.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there's no Straussianism, which I think is an important point, but there are Straussians and even a sort of schools of Straussians. And so what was that, according to his intention or despite his wish for everyone to think for himself? Or
I think it was according to his intention. He wanted everybody to think for himself, but he also wanted people to see and maybe follow out and work out for themselves the insights that he had discovered, because he thought they were so important. They were intended to recover the possibility of philosophy in our time from the two main enemies that it had, science and history. Science saying that the only real knowledge is scientific knowledge. And philosophy has to be the same thing as science. Otherwise, it's just valuing, wishing, hoping. History, that there isn't any possibility of a permanent question or permanent solution, that the permanent doesn't exist, that everything moves, and in a way, nothing moves because there's nothing to move. So that's paradox, you could say, of history and also refutation of it. So his two great enemies were science and history, and I think he wanted to found a school which would make philosophy possible again along the general lines that he had begun. So that would be a kind of school or sect, you could use that term, which is used by Machiavelli and Bacon and others to mean religion, but also a way of thinking. It's a school that's open to the whole of philosophy, both ancient and modern. So it isn't a school in the sense of the Epicureans or the Stoics, say, which did have definite doctrines, things you had to believe in order to belong to. So that there are disagreements among Straussians, and the West Coast Straussians versus the East Coast. That's a famous disagreement. The West Coast wanting politics to be more like philosophy, or to be good friends, best friends of philosophy, indeed perhaps identical, twins perhaps, to go that far. And the East Coast, that's where I am.
Right.
To maintain a certain estrangement, even between such a wonderful country as America and such a wonderful philosopher as Aristotle.
Right.
So there are these disagreements within the school, but I think it's quite clear that he intended to start a school. He did this especially in his book, Thoughts on Machiavelli, which I believe was intended to be especially directed to a student who wanted to learn how to read esoterically and who wanted to see how modernity, how our time fits into the history of philosophy. So in that book, he gives makes all these wonderful little textual discoveries of Machiavelli the strange numerology that he makes use of, significant numbers and so on, and the placement of remarks, the many ways in which Machiavelli has of intimating his thought as opposed to just saying it out loud. However good he was at saying things out loud.
Right.
Yeah. Goodness is not enough. La bontà non basta. That's a wonderful Machiavellian phrase. So there was all this in Machiavelli, plus his trying to place Machiavelli in what he called the great tradition. And this had reason in Machiavelli because Machiavelli, too, seems to refer to the tradition of philosophy, which he wants to change. He wanted to change it to make philosophy more capable, more powerful. So for him, philosophy should have an agenda of things to do, things to change. Marx once said that philosophers have hitherto been satisfied with interpreting the world. The point now is to change it. But Machiavelli said that and meant that a lot earlier than Marx, and so that would be, but it's a good statement of what modernity implies. So perhaps this is a way of introducing the question of the ancients and the moderns in Strauss. If esotericism is his grand discovery, which is you might say point of method or methodology, the way philosophers operate, the distinction between the ancients and the moderns is perhaps more substantive, or leads to his more substantive thought, and that's that recovers that again is a rediscovery and not just a discovery. It rediscovers some events of the 17th century. Jonathan Swift spoke of the ancients and the moderns and the battle of the books, the modern books versus the ancient books. And Gulliver's Travels is a good deal about the way moderns behave, led or bewildered as they are by philosophy, as opposed to the ancients who somehow live much better on the basis of common sense. So this is not a new distinction again, but it's newly understood. And Strauss's new understanding of the ancients and moderns is that the ancients are still possible, and that they have not been covered over, or they have been covered over, but they have not been made obsolete by modern principles. And when Machiavelli wanted philosophy to change, to become occupied with politics and with political change and improving things, and this was developed by Francis Bacon. Science should be philosophy, or philosophy should be science, and science should be concerned with the relief of man's estate, sort of a much more practical goal than just contemplation or just understanding. So that was a way of saying that philosophy should take a turn, and that turn, the modern turn, you could say, had to do with opposing the weakness combined with the cruelty of the prevailing system of thought, which was Christianity. So it was an attack on Christianity, the moderns at the beginning. And so you might think that then this modernity, or this way of understanding philosophy, would be just a temporary accommodation to a problem which didn't exist for the ancients, as the ancients didn't have such a commanding religion. They had a religion that a philosopher could live with more easily, a polytheism or something. That wasn't a rival, such a grand and obvious rival to philosophy in philosophical terms, the way Christianity was. So, Christianity then might then seem to be a temporary thing. But once the modern way of doing philosophy gets started, it's hard to stop, and one looks for ways to carry it on rather than for ways to get out of it. Or it becomes more and more difficult to get out of it because modern philosophy has its triumphs. It has its fruits. That's Francis Bacon's word, the fruits of philosophy. And the greatest fruit of philosophy, it's pretty clear today, is modern medicine. And this was just what Bacon thought would be the most attractive way of improving the standing, the morals, the reputation of philosophy, is to get it to make people or enable people to live longer. So as soon as you bring up your doubts about modernity, other people will react, or you yourself might think, what about modern medicine that's kept me alive? That's true of me. So, and most everyone these days. So how do you get out of that? And also, the ancients seem to be based on the polis, which is a very small, in modern terms, intimate community, totally different from our great United States with its continental extent and its marvelous diversity of peoples and thoughts and places. So the polis doesn't seem to be applicable to today, and yet for some reason we still use the word political. We can't get out of that word, and and you'll find it everywhere. And it's used with the same notion of close community. So you can have politics in a university or in a corporation or in a symphony orchestra or in any human association, the problems of how to govern and who should rule. So politics today is an adjective without a noun. And perhaps then we need to go back and look at the polis in order to find the noun that our adjective, which we still find useful, describes. So that would be a kind of answer, a beginning answer to the question of the relevancy of ancient thought. And then, of course, it isn't all that great sometimes to live so long, to have your life prolonged beyond its viability, really. You call that living?
Right.
Maybe it isn't. So people still die, and they still have lingering deaths, and so that, together with other triumphs of modern technology, like the atomic bomb and other weapons of mass destruction. So it's a whole package that you get of modernity,
Right.
and it's hard to take. I'll take the good parts and forget the bad parts. You can't do that. It seems to be a package deal. So there again, you can question it, at least in your thinking, and look back at the origins of modernity. So what Strauss wanted to do was to challenge the irreversibility of the modern. They say modern sort of covers up the alternatives to modern.
Right.
It prevents you from seeing the question as it originally presented itself to Machiavelli and Bacon, the early moderns, the most interesting, I think, and the deepest of the modern thinkers. Are those two, maybe? And so you need to be able to challenge this irreversibility. See, once you say that modernity is irreversible, then it doesn't seem as if it can. There's any way out.
Right.
And that's the character of this seemingly temporary beginning which is made. Once you say that it's possible for philosophers to bring reason into politics and morality, into society, and provide a rational society, it's very hard to get away from that. Because if you say that the rational society is not possible, then it seems as if philosophy is not possible.
Right.
So any difficulties that you have in society seem to extend to philosophy, and so because you've enormously increase the ambition of philosophy and the stakes of philosophy. Philosophy has to show much more. It has to show itself and prove itself to non-philosophers in a way which it never had to before. So that tends to, in other words, erase the distinction between philosophy and non-philosophy. And it tends to, therefore, to undermine the basis of reason itself. So whereas the modern world started out as a great promotion of human reason as against superstition and prejudice and custom, now at the end, it's human reason that comes under attack, under questioning and attack. And we no longer are confident that there is such a thing as progress, or that we are living more and more reasonably. And this is the most modern philosopher is still Nietzsche, end of the 19th century, and he was the one who most deeply saw this and promoted this critique of modernity as essentially leading to nihilism, to saying that no criterion is a good guide for our lives, and this includes reason. Reason is the one that makes us the least interesting, the most boring, and the least ambitious.
It seems to me that a lot of thinkers over the years obviously have been struck by the problems of modernity and have yearned for something else and been nostalgic for an older time or romantic about other possibilities. But I do think, with Strauss, you have the defense of reason out of classical rationalism as an alternative to modern rationalism, and apparently he's inclined to think perhaps a superior alternative. I've always thought that was important in of itself, but also be important as a way out of the kind of typical modern paradox, or not paradox, but I don't know what exactly, situation of seeing modernity as deeply problematic and then thinking there's no alternative except a kind of leap of faith of some sort, or romantic.
That's right, yes. Yeah. No, Strauss was certainly not a romantic.
Yeah.
He looked down on that. That was simply sort of an unthought out rejection of modern rationality. Not unreasonable, or the rejection isn't unreasonable, but the way in which it is done is because to be against superstition and prejudice and custom is the way of reason. That's true. Right. It's just that most people need superstition and prejudice and custom, and that's and to find a way of expressing that so that it's healthy instead of limiting is the work of the exoteric work of a philosopher, of a political philosopher. So so Strauss was a classical rationalist as opposed to a modern rationalist. So it isn't that the thing to do is not to be a conservative in the way of getting rid of reason, but rather of redirecting reason and seeing what can be recovered for it from the attacks of history and science.
Yeah, so that, in that respect, I suppose the art of writing as the methodological breakthrough, if that's the right word, and the ancients and moderns is kind of a, I don't know what, organizing principle you might say, or and then both fit in, I think, with the, I guess what one might say is the third great or obvious theme that Strauss and Straussians emphasize so much, which is philosophy in the city, or
philosophy and politics. Yes.
Yeah, philosophy and politics.
Right, or philosophy in the city. Yeah, that would be a description of the way the ancients saw things, that there was always a tension between society and philosophy, or between a life of action and a life of contemplation, a life devoted to reason versus a life devoted to getting things done. So that's what Strauss thought. He phrased this too in an interesting way. that he sometimes said that the theme of his work was the theological-political question.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to know what that means, theological-political question. But I would try something like this, that the question is, who governs us? Who governs us human beings? Is it God, or is it we ourselves? If it's God, then we should adjust to God. And if it's we ourselves, then God should adjust himself to us, to our political necessities. And then the question also becomes, what sort of God? Is this a mild or tolerant God, or is it an angry or jealous God? Does God second us or promote in us the desire to get vengeance on our enemies and to punish those who are unjust? Or is God a more tolerant, liberal-minded sort of fellow who doesn't like to pass judgment? So this theological political question is really the kind of development of the political question, the question of any political regime. Who rules? And who rules is the way of asking the question, how are we ruled? Because you'll be ruled differently according to who rules, whether we regard ourselves as agents or instruments or creatures of God, or whether we think ourselves independent and entitled to a God that respects our independence. So it's a way of asking the question about philosophy and politics, but which emphasizes the importance of religion for politics, and a Straussian, I think you can always tell by the fact that although they may be personally, politically very interested and very partisan, they've always got in their minds something which is above politics, and a way of life, or a way of living, a philosophical way of living, which is asking rather than answering questions. To be a politician, you have to have answers. Mm-hmm. You can use your questions, but those are to disrupt the answers of your enemies, your opponents. So you can be skeptical, but not about yourself. Right. You have to play offense, as like the politicians like to say. Otherwise, you're playing defense. So you've got to have something to assert, a program. And that means a different mode of being and thinking from someone who contemplates, observes, comments, and clicks without getting angry.
Right. It does seem that Straussians are both, if I can oversimplify wildly, sort of defenders of philosophy on the one hand, and defenders of politics, though, on the other.
Yes, right. I feel both of those impulses in myself.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Strauss encourages them both.
Yeah,
though,
he
in
does.
A sense, defending politics against the reduction of politics.
Yes, that's right.
I don't know what you call history or sociology, or lack of human agency on the one hand, and then, of course, the defense of philosophy, which is different from the defense of politics.
He had students who loved politics and students who loved philosophy, right. And he encouraged them both. I think that's quite right. And he said things too, or wrote things in different publications of his, which would give encouragement to one or the other. Right. And so, and this is, I think, a very good. Now, why would Strauss want to promote politics or encourage politics? And that's because our politics seems to be, especially in the progressive part, the notion that modern politics is a kind of progress from prejudice to rationality. that seems to be hostile in itself to politics, because it says that we can set aside questions once we've solved them and go on to new questions and solve them. And that means that those questions that we've solved are no longer open for political discussion. So to promote politics is a way of promoting the impermanence of politics, and that's actually a freeing of discussion, right, and opening up of issues that people want to settle permanently through legislative decision. And the best way to oppose them is to promote politics in the sense of issues to be discussed and decided.
So I suppose dogmatism or scientism or progressivism or religious doctrine, all these things are both enemies in a way of true philosophy and true politics.
They are.
So somehow defending...
They narrow us. Both of them try to narrow us. And you can look at the scientific dystopias, so to see us narrowed in the way that progress, in quotes, attempts.
Strauss's works are also impressive and wonderful. This is maybe a kind of crazy question, but do you have a favorite book or essay of Strauss's that you just...
Yes, his favorite book, I once raised that question with him.
Oh.
And so I prefaced it by saying that my favorite was Thoughts on Machiavelli. Well, I was working on Machiavelli, and his book was my guide, my prince, if you like. But he looked at me and said, yes, he had a lot of fun writing that. And I said in the footnotes, and he said, yeah, that's right. That's where he especially enjoyed himself. And what he did in the footnotes of that book was to set little puzzles for his students to come along and try to discover. And some of them were easy and some were hard, and I got some of them, but by no means all.
You learned a lot in trying to decipher them, though?
Of course you do, yes, yeah. For example, here's one. This is a numerological one. In the Prince and the Discourses taken together, as if they were one book, there are 14 uses of the word form and 51 uses of the word matter. Now, that tells you immediately, because 14 and 51 are multiples of 7 and 17, that this is a question of nomos and phusis, of convention or custom and nature, because the Greek philosophers used those numbers, 7 to indicate nomos, or what was customary or political or legal, and 17 to indicate what was natural. So for Machiavelli, what he's saying is that what is natural is only matter and not forms. Forms are put there by custom or by politics or by the prince. But he just left it like that, Strauss did. And
left it just at the numbers.
Yes, the 14 and the 51.
He didn't explain what you've just said.
Certainly did not explain what I just said.
Right.
And moreover, he did not add them up for you. 14 and 51, when added, are 65, which is a multiple of 13, and 13 is Machiavelli's number, indicating this is me, and this is my enterprise, and this is what I'm doing. So he is saying that my enterprise is to understand form and matter as conventional or political forming of matter, and there are no definitions, no ideas, no essences, and this is my doing, and also and incidentally. It shows you that the Prince and the Discourses on Livy, which are two quite different works, are also, from a certain point of view, from this highest point of view, one book.
So Strauss had or indicated that Thoughts was his favorite.
Yeah, and now all
book.
this was in a footnote, at the end of a footnote, which was really directed to something else. So that was the kind of fun you have doing this. But then Strauss, answering me, said that he thought his favorite book was Socrates and Aristophanes. And that was because, well, he says, I learned something new. And
would you care to hazard a guess as to
guess
what that was?
My guess is that the new thing that's in there, or the most prominent new thing, is the idea of the comic equivalent. That there's a funny way of making a serious point, and that this is how best to understand the philosophy in Aristophanes, or serious or even tragic point. So the comic equivalent. So those were maybe two favorites, but other people have other favorites. Certainly, his works on Plato are the most Straussian in the sense of most remote from current controversy.
Right.
If you read them, they look like mere summaries of what Plato said, but summaries that occasionally make a remark. And also summaries that occasionally leave out things or put things in a certain order. So here he seems to be imitating the Arabic philosophers that he first studied. One mustn't forget that Strauss was a leading Arabic, a student of Arabic philosophy in the Middle Ages, and is well known in that field. And he had a great student who became a professor at Harvard, a colleague of mine, Muhsin Mahdi, who was in the Near East department, who also was a very renowned scholar, especially of the Arabian Nights. So Strauss had this absolutely marvelous comprehensiveness to him. There was nothing that he couldn't touch and turn to gold. And his students, however, never achieved that. So they were all students in one branch of his complex works. So he started with studies of not just Arabic but also Jewish philosophy, also Maimonides, of course.
Right.
And there he's known as a Maimonides scholar, and is somewhat notorious for having questioned Maimonides' faith or belief in Judaism, and so that's another instance of his sort of subversive influence on modern scholarship, as you might say. And then he wrote, when his first book was called Philosophy and Law, which was also a study of Jewish things and the way in which Jewish philosophers questioned the legal findings of the rabbis. And then he wrote a book on Spinoza, which was an excellent study of Spinoza and his antecedents. And he wrote a book on Hobbes. What's the title of that? I don't know, the political...
Something about the
political theory of Hobbes, or something like that, which is, I think, quite well known and actually rather respectable among Hobbes scholars.
So that's a sort of pre-Straussian...
Yeah, some kind of pre-Straussian view of Hobbes. He shows that there are sort of two general trends in Hobbes' thinking. One is morals and the other is science. And he says that morals comes first, that he chose science because of the morals. The question of morals, he wanted to be able to reduce Hobbes wanted to be able to reduce politics to a more viable morality that was within reach of possibility, more than Aristotelian virtues. And that this was why he chose science. So he was not fundamentally a scientist, but instrumentally so.
And that seems to be a position Strauss held to later, and
yes, right,
informed his study of other moderns.
Yeah, that's right. That modernity is not essentially a philosophical or scientific discovery; it's a moral discovery or a philosophical discovery, which issues in science, the natural science that we know today, and in the politics of rights that we live in. So, what else?
Well, those were kind of the pre-Straussian Strauss,
Pre-Straussian.
which is still awfully impressive. If
Yes.
any normal person
That's right.
had done that for his career, he'd be a
That's
major
right.
scholar. But
Yeah.
then he has the breakthrough on the art of writing, and
Yes,
writes a
the,
bunch of essays in
Persecution
the
and the Art of
40s,
Writing.
and
Yes, yeah.
then really the three books that I guess introduced him in America are Persecution and the Art of, on Tyranny, which is
Yeah, on tyranny, we mustn't
a
forget.
commentary on it.
Yeah,
I mean, it's so as if he wanted to take the hardest case to prove that he's right about how these philosophers wrote. Because you take Xenophon,
yes,
not Plato, not
Right.
anyone
Yeah.
famous, and you showed that
Yeah.
Xenophon wrote with this unimaginable care and
yeah.
cleverness and
Yes.
wit. And
The most recondite philosopher, or the most hidden philosopher, with the worst reputation, is the one that he wants to save.
Yeah.
And that was Xenophon.
And so if you prove it for Xenophon, it almost,
Yeah, that's
by definition, it must
that's
be true.
right.
of
A
Plato.
fortiori, yes.
Right.
Everything else is easier.
So that on Tyranny, which he presents as an introductory book in a way, though it's an
Yeah.
awfully deep introductory book, and then Natural Writing.
Natural Writing.
Persecution and the Art of Writing, on Tyranny, Natural Writing History are sort of all in a group, and then then Machiavelli.
Yeah,
And then he seems to have decided in
yeah,
the last 15 years of his life to
yeah,
study the Greeks and
yeah.
write,
Right.
as you said
Yeah.
earlier, a terser and more
Yes.
philosophic way, maybe,
Right.
commentaries that would help
Right.
his very best students understand Xenophon's Aristophanes, Plato,
Yeah.
Socrates. I mean, those are pretty
Yeah.
hard books to just pick up. The Xenophon books that he
Yeah.
writes in the
Yeah.
60s. And
Yeah.
the,
That's the picture, I would say.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
But Natural Writing History is what first drew
Is what
you, and you'd
first
still
got me.
recommend first.
I would, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that has Hobbes in it. Otherwise, you could start with his Hobbes book. But that doesn't take you to his real,
Right.
his radical questioning and his real position.
And I do think the title essay, Persecution and the Art of Writing, is just a fantastic
Yeah.
sort of statement of,
Yes.
the claim about the art of writing, which puts it in a pretty
Yeah.
commonsensical way that people
Yes.
gives it more of a...
He used to laugh. He once found his book in the etiquette section of a bookshop.
Oh, is that
Yeah,
right?
and the art of writing. So
that's good.
It's a question of manners.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and that was the kind of thing he loved, to see the connection between manners, this sort of superficial thing, and something much deeper. So and that's too why he had a certain appreciation for certain writers like Agatha Christie, who was good at portraying manners and the significance of manners. You would try to look at the manners of each of her characters to see whether the possibility of being a murderer is contained.
Right.
So that's the kind of lovely sort of thing. He liked to read P.G. Wodehouse. He liked to read Mickey Spillane. He liked to watch Perry Mason.
Right.
He had a taste for the superficial. In P.G. Wodehouse, Strauss compared the relationship between Jeeves and Bertie Wooster. Jeeves, the intelligent valet; Bertie Wooster, the not so intelligent. Nice guy, to the philosopher and the gentleman. And then the philosopher was the gentleman learned to go to the philosopher to answer his problems and to solve the difficulties of his life. And Bertie is always a very nice guy. He always wants to do the right thing. He just doesn't quite succeed in doing it. But on the other hand, there's a defect in Jeeves too, and that's that his schemes are often too complicated.
Right.
And they depend on the actors who are as intelligent as he, so that even the philosopher can go wrong as well. So this is a comic writer, P.G. Wodehouse, and he wrote 100 novels or so, and who doesn't seem to have a thought in his mind, but
Deceptive.
and actually, Strauss made something or saw something that was there. And if you're a Straussian, you go around reading things and going to movies and trying to find things, sometimes foolishly or too ambitiously or in a silly way, but still he teaches that habit in you.
And did he personally? I never met him, and at least maybe when I was a really little kid, I might have, if he ever came to my parents' apartment when my father published a couple of his books, but I'm not sure that he ever did. But in any case, I certainly never met him knowingly. Did he have? One has the sense that he must have had a sort of impish sense of humor, but did
Yes.
that come out? I mean, when you...
Yes, very much so, yes. He was a short man, shorter even than I. And he had a big smile with these glasses, a German accent he never got rid of or even changed much.
Right.
Yeah, although he became a perfect writer in English, you wouldn't know.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing. That's
yeah,
also too
it's
little
something-
commented on, just taken for granted that, of course,
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
a great and powerful writer when he wants to be, and when
Yes.
he, sometimes misleadingly, you might say, at certain, like the end of the Machiavelli book, when he wants to be more rhetorical,
Yeah.
he can be really powerful and moving, and that's not
Yeah.
his native. When did he first?
Yeah,
I don't know. Start writing in
yeah.
English. He must have been already
Yeah.
in his 30s. I mean, he wasn't a
Yes.
young man. It's not like an 18-year-old coming over, you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. No, so that was a totally amazing thing. He liked to smoke cigarettes, which was, of course, bad for him. He had a holder for a cigarette, so it was not. It didn't directly touch his lips, but there was this a certain distance between the smoke, or the end of the cigarette, and himself, sort of like FDR,
Right.
who also smoked with a cigarette holder. It gave him a kind of raffish and debonair
right.
air when he was smoking, which he continued to do after his heart attack. It wasn't good for him. And he was very impish. He liked to make jokes. So this was in the time of our reading group. It was a time when the United States was negotiating with the Soviet Union, and there was always a question of whether we needed to make concessions in order to get the other side to negotiate. A current matter,
Yes.
right today, but or whether we shouldn't make unilateral concessions. And so he said that he was willing to make a unilateral concession to the Soviet Union, and this was that all words that begin in English with H could be pronounced G, as in Russian. So Gittler, he was perfectly, and Geidiger. Those were two German names that he was going to sacrifice to the Soviet Union in order to get them to come to the bargaining table with us.
He didn't otherwise approve of the
Right.
concessions we were
No.
making.
And I remember too, he would play games. So people whose last names are philosophic and last names are political, and the same name political, but have different first names, like John Dewey, philosopher, and Tom Dewey, politician.
Uh-huh.
So how many of those could you find? That kind of thing. Yeah. So games like that is fun. And also in these gossip sessions in our reading group, he would comment on the politics of the day, and also his rivals or his friends. Jacob Klein, his friend, Hans-Georg Gadamer, his more of a rival or more friend plus rival guy. It happened that this was in 1960 at Berkeley, that Gadamer came out with his great book, Truth and Method, and Strauss immediately read it and wrote him a long letter criticizing it. And so he retailed this to us in our conversation. He was human and close, but he was a philosopher. You were in the presence of, you felt his presence.
Yeah, and that seems to be what he really.
He
enjoyed all the other stuff.
There was a recent movie, made of Lincoln, which I thought did very well in putting onto film and into a movie the greatness of a person, and the way in which all those in the film recognized that this was not just an anybody that you were dealing with. So I had that, and that was a wonderful experience in my life.
That's great. Let's talk a minute about a few of your fellow students of Strauss, and who are friends of yours and close friends in some cases, and themselves important scholars and thinkers. I don't know which one Seth Benardete. I think you met him.
Yes, Seth Benardete.
When you were both quite young, right?
I did. When I was that would be some time when I was a graduate student, or
He came to
when
Harvard.
I was writing. That would be in the late 1950s. I was introduced to him by Allan Bloom. He said, "There's my friend Seth Benardete, who's at Harvard. You must meet him." It turns out that we were both living in Eliot House. I had an office there, and he was a junior fellow and had rooms there. So we were both in the same senior common room, and we got to know each other. And he was, I think, the best student of Strauss, of all of them. That's my judgment. But I think he was the deepest and the quickest of all of Strauss students whom I met. We would have lunch in Eliot House at Harvard, and somebody incautiously, some professor or student incautiously would sit down with us, and usually Benardete reduced him to blithering after 2 or 3 minutes of questioning. He would go after and say, what do you principally study, or what is it you're doing, what is your dissertation on? And after a very short period of time, that person was completely lost and had to be questioning everything that he believed from the Word. So, and this was like it was a kind of a mini experience of Socrates, watching him operate.
How you become unpopular, maybe.
Yes, how to become unpopular with it. Yes, so in a way that it didn't make them really unpopular, but it certainly didn't make him president either.
Right.
Anyway, so he was a Greek scholar. He knew. One could say he knows more Greek than God, and he was that rare thing, a combination of a philologist with a philosopher. Most philologists don't really care much about the philosophy of the people whose language they study, and often have very foolish things to say about it. And most philosophers don't know much Greek, especially to the extent that Seth Benardete did. His colleagues in the Department of Classics at NYU, where he ended up teaching, would always go to him. Any question that came up, you didn't know something, go ask SB. That was Seth Benardete. So he worked all day. He stayed in his office and read and read and read, and he read everything. He knew everything. And he had a family. So at first he started off sort of almost a dehumanized philosopher when I knew him at first. He would call me Mansfield by my last name. We were good friends. Funny way to behave, even in those more formal days. But then he met a girl named Jane Johnson, who was an English graduate student in English, American literature actually, and they fell in love and got married and had children, and that turned him from a philosopher into more of a human being, if you can say that it's correct to make a distinction between those two things.
Right.
But he started calling me Harvey, and he had 2 wonderful children, Emma and Ethan, who further humanized him. So it was amusing and kind of inspiring to watch him being educated, so to speak, out of his philosophy into a closer appreciation. So he was a family man, and he was a philosopher scholar, right? But in between, he had not much existence in society generally or in politics. He followed politics, but he had no passions about it. So
he doesn't seem to have tried very hard to make his work. I mean, his work is so
his work
daunting.
He wrote very daunting works, and very, very hard. Just to show you how, just open it up and look at one page and see how much he was able to find. And these are books mostly on Plato, but also on Homer, and later he wrote on the Latin or about Latin authors. But the theme of his work was poetry and philosophy. In Plato's Republic, in Book 10, there's a statement referring to the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy. So poetry stands for what is particular, and it also stands for what seems to be revealed by muses.
Right.
If you're a poet, you're inspired by something. It's not that you think it out beforehand. And poets don't like it if you ask them, what is the point of your poem? Because if they tell you the point of your poem, then you don't need to read the poem anymore. And also, he would give you the point of the poem in other words than the poetry of the poem, which would seem to say that, well, why don't we just talk about the point instead of all this poetry, which is really unnecessary. Whereas philosophy talks about not what is particular, but what is universal, and not what is revealed, but what is observable and what is thinkable, reasonable. So, but he attacked that quarrel and tried to show that poetry was more philosophical than it looks like, and philosophy more poetic, and that there was perhaps together they were one thing with two different sides. And who could deny that Plato is poetical?
Right.
And who can deny that Homer is philosophical? Except most classicists.
But once you see Benerdete's
fools that they are, yes, all they have to do is read Benardete, and that would be a kind of, a punishment for them.
Right.
That would be close to a life sentence, or even death.
Right. Discredit all their other work. That would be bad.
It would be. And that was one of the great things about Strauss, that he made a lot of scholarship just irrelevant and foolish, and it was totally based on the wrong presumption.
Right.
Most scholarship is based on the presumption that when a man says something, that's what he thinks. So they never consider that sometimes he would say something you didn't fully mean.
Right.
The word irony doesn't figure in their thinking.
Right.
So, and isn't Socrates notorious for his irony? So that's just a way, kind of beginning, by which one might attack most modern scholarship. And so most modern scholars didn't like Strauss or Straussians. They disbelieve, they disapprove, and sometimes it gets even worse than that. They get quite ferocious.
Yeah. And Strauss suffered those attacks, and others
But
have.
this never worried Seth Benardete. He was totally above this, and he didn't care that he never got the recognition that he deserved as a scholar, or really the awe that he should have had from his fellow classicists. But whereas other people like Allan Bloom.
Yeah, so let's talk about Allan Bloom. Seth Benardete was probably the greatest student of Strauss, who's the most obscure, perhaps, in the broad world of
That's true.
Of intellectuals and professors, whereas Bloom is maybe the best-selling student of Strauss.
Yes,
ever,
the opposite. He was the most brilliant, and also the most successful, you could say, in the way of writing a bestseller, The Closing of the American Mind, which was sold 1 million copies in a year. Made him a rich man, Allan. We always called him Bloom, even if you were his friends. Bloom made him a rich man. The funny thing is that he always lived his life as a rich man. And it was only towards the end of it, when he published this best-selling book, that he was able to afford what otherwise he had to borrow from people like me, say, with our small minds. Didn't know really how to spend money, even though I had a wife and children in college and a house and so on. None of these he needed. He was a bachelor and had really nobody to spend money on except himself. And he excelled at that.
Yeah.
He loved that. He once told me, because I like to shop at Filene's Basement, where you could get fine clothes for cheap prices. He says, "Son, yeah, you have the taste of Louis XIV shopping at Filene's Basement." And I always thought that, at first thought when I heard that was quite a compliment. He was complimenting my thrift and my success. But no, then when I learned him and learned and knew him better, it's better to spend more than less. And that's because that's what a magnificent person does. It's one of Aristotle's virtues. And so he would always spend more. He once was in a shop where they sold high-fidelity musical equipment, and with another student, and said, and then he remarked, and so Bloom said to the salesman, "That's the best you've got. Isn't that correct?" And the man said, "No, Mr. Bloom, it isn't the best, but it's the most expensive." And Bloom said, "That's what I'll take. That's what I'll take." So these are the wonderful quirks of Allan Bloom. But his brilliance made him a brilliant teacher. He was the best of the Straussian teachers, and probably still is. He had the art of conversion, which of a young man usually, but also women, into a Straussian, and how to do this. It wasn't really a conscious art in his sense, or at least it didn't seem to be. But his own brilliance, his wit, his jokes. It was said that you could stand outside his classroom and hear constant gales of laughter. If you're another professor and you say, "How I wish I could do that in my class." Yeah. So that's happened to me once or twice, and just to hear him holding forth, it was quite an experience. So he was so good at getting young people into philosophy. It was partly that he saw them outside the classroom.
Yeah.
Being a bachelor, he didn't have people he didn't have a family to preoccupy him. Right. So he had a lot more free time, and he would use it to teach sort of kids music, how to listen to fine music, and how to talk about and read about and talk about literature, things that weren't on the syllabus of the class that he taught.
He also had a real insight into people's characters.
Yes, he did.
I think, in a way
he was
that's
extremely
unusual.
good. He could read you.
Yeah.
See what you
young
wanted.
people.
Right.
He adapted, it seems to me.
And he always tried to make you a little bit more honest than you are. He would do that to me all the time.
Is that right?
Yeah.
About yourself, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, about yourself,
Not
of
about
course.
him?
No, he didn't. All right.
No,
You're right. No, to be honest about him was to admire him.
I see. That's what's appropriate.
So and he would send me students. He was at Cornell most of the time that I knew him. Also at Toronto, he would send me his BAs to get PhDs done. And I once said, He said, "You really teach them, and I just give them a little polish."
Yeah.
And he looked at me and he said, "Harvey, but you do it so well."
Yeah, so that's
So that was good enough for
compliment from him.
Yeah,
and
that was good
say a
enough for
word
me.
about the closing of The American Mind.
And that was a book. It was just an amazing book. One week after it was published, I started seeing it under students' arms in Harvard Yard.
Yeah.
I never had that experience before. The Closing of the American Mind, that was in 1987. That was a book about the American universities and how they were miseducating their students, making them narrower in the way I mentioned before. And it was full of wonderful observations of students, of the importance of rock music,
Right.
of the drug culture, things like that, all of which we professors sort of didn't know or overlooked or despised. He studied and watched. He really got into the lives and the hearts and the minds of young people, and he saw so clearly how they were being misled by the professors that they had to listen to. And so then he went after he studied the students in the first part of the book, he went after the professors and showed how they were all slaves of German thinking,
Right.
essentially of Heidegger and Nietzsche and Heidegger, and all the damage that those German thinkers had done in the politics, the clear, rational Enlightenment politics of America.
Right.
So that was a wonderful book, and it still is a wonderful book. And if you wanted to get look at a work by a Straussian, that's really excellent. That's definitely something to look at, and perhaps you could even begin a study of Strauss from that book. That's what Strauss is applied to our life, and it shows you the relevance of Plato and Aristotle,
Right.
in a way that that Strauss's more scholarly work doesn't do. So that was really an experience to watch and to be with and to enjoy with him. He loved it, and he made everything of it, and he gave speeches to rich people and businessmen, and
Yes.
made a lot of money on the lecture circuit as well as from royalties of his book. So that was a pleasure to see.
Good and well deserved. I think you once admitted that he had bottled himself or something. Reading the book gave you a little bit of the experience of what it must have been like to study with him or to be a friend
Yeah.
of his, even that he
That's
sort
right.
of had bottled himself and put himself into this book in a way that
Yeah.
is unusual. It wasn't a work
Yeah.
of commentary or scholarship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ernest Fortin was also a good friend of yours and a great student of Strauss.
Yes.
A little different from Bloom or Benardete, I suppose.
Ernest Fortin was a priest of the Assumptionist order, a minor, almost unknown order, and that I think exists in Canada and in France, given to scholarship. He was one of the most erudite persons I ever knew, and a man of great wit, too, and not one to rely on his priestly dignity. When I first met him, I started calling him Father, and then he looked at me and said, "Oh, Professor Mansfield," as if being a professor were equal to being a priest, which of course it is not.
Right.
But so he was a very easygoing priest. I remember once he was a good friend of Allan Bloom's too. Once we were together in Paris, sitting at a table at the Café de Flore, which was Allan Bloom's great haunt there. He liked to be where Jean-Paul Sartre had been, and others. So, Bloom said in his expansive way, "Here we are, the three of us, Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. These are Americans." So, America is the uniting and coming together of these three great religions, as if any one of us was really a proper representative of his religion. Well, Ernest was a little bit closer than the other two of us. And so Ernest studied medieval political philosophy. So, and of course, mostly the Christians, although It wasn't that he wasn't acquainted with Maimonides or Averroes or others, but he specialized in two things. The first was the Church Fathers and their relationship to philosophy. The Church Fathers, of course, includes St. Augustine and St. Jerome, but he also wrote on others less well known, like St. Clement of Alexandria and others of that time. It was always, especially in early Christianity, it was a great question what to do with philosophy. Philosophy seems to be denounced in the Bible, or at least criticized in the Bible by St. Paul when he speaks of those who are lukewarm believers. So, in other words, philosophers who made accommodation to Christianity but didn't deeply accept it or believe it. And so so it was really, and there were figures like Gregory the Great or Tertullian or others who really thought that philosophy was an enemy that should be extirpated by the Christian church. But no, the church was, you could say the church was saved, but the church saved philosophy in a way that we're all indebted to it for. In that early period when it could have crushed or at least heavily damaged what remained of Greek and Roman Latin philosophy, but on the contrary maintained it, and this was of course especially the work of St. Augustine, but also of these others among the church fathers, St. Jerome too. Philosophy could be a handmaid to religion, and that was a role which had a certain independence to it, in fact, if not in theory. And then his other Ernest Fortin's other great topic was Dante, and he wrote, that's the title of his book. He just wrote one book, Dissent and Philosophy in the Middle Ages, and it's a book on Dante's Divine Comedy, which he shows is altogether an esoteric work. It's an esoteric work of a certain character, a different character, because the esotericism is not hidden. There's so many obvious puzzles to follow out when you read Dante that you overlook the ones which aren't so obvious. And so if you don't do that, and if you follow out what Ernest Fortin found, you can begin to question whether how faithful a Christian Dante was, though of course he was known as the Christian philosopher, and still is. Right. So what Strauss did to Maimonides, Fortin did to Dante, sort of following Strauss, one could say. There are still now also 4 volumes of Ernest Fortin's essays, which deserve to be read, every single one of them. He was a man of great wit, and he was very good at introducing speakers. So to be introduced by Ernest was a challenge, how he would respond, and also a pleasure, because he was so amusing. So he was a wonderful man, and he had a great influence at Assumption College and at Boston College, where both of which he taught in the theology departments. And the sort of the uneasy relationship between theology and philosophy, that was his specialty, and that's where he lived. And he was a wonderful guy.
Say a word, maybe a conclusion about, just as occurs to me listening to the wit of Bloom, Fortin, Benardete in a slightly different way, I think. Strauss himself. I mean, there's something.
They're all very funny men.
Yeah. What is
yes.
what is the relation of that to philosophizing or to rediscovering the art of writing? I mean,
it is irony. Things aren't as they seem, and serious things are often decided for unserious reasons.
Right.
And unserious things can be very much more important than they seem. And yes, so wit is not just an accompaniment, but part of the essence of philosophy. Of course, you can be superficial and witty,
Right.
like Noel Coward say,
Right.
but still, that we are amused, is a sign that there's something interesting there.
And the wit points to something deeper,
Yes,
maybe.
it does. The wit points to something ridiculous, some disproportion, something unexpected. All those are wit. So,
Yeah, the
there's something.
modern disposition is so much to be so serious, takes tragedy very seriously, and
Yes,
comedy superficial, but somehow Strauss seems to suggest a little bit.
yes, that's right.
Maybe not quite the opposite, but
Almost the opposite.
Almost the opposite.
Almost the opposite. Yeah. Tragedy ends up as something political, essentially political, and comedy is something philosophical. You're laughing. While you're laughing, you're not thinking. So that's, you could say, is the superficial part of comedy. and when you're sent off into gales of laughter, so that your thought process stops. But then afterwards you think, well, why did I laugh, and what was so good about that? It hit the spot. That's another thing. Comedy is successful. Tragedy is unsuccessful. Well, you can have a perfect tragedy, a Shakespearean tragedy.
Right.
King Lear, that's perfect. But it's perfect as a tragedy, as something which isn't perfect. So it's not. It needs to be supplemented by the laughs that we get in life.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for taking this time to discuss Leo Strauss and Straussians.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure, and
Yeah.
thank you for joining us on Conversations.